Welcome to the Listening Well podcast, friends. Thank you for stumbling upon this platform where I explore the different areas of what it means to live well, all with the aim to transform our lives from chaos into clarity. I'm your host, Stephanie Bovis, and today I have a very special guest joining me for this very rich conversation. Dr. Oberdan Marianetti is a psychologist and clinical sexologist. He has been on this path for the last 2 decades. And after leaving the corporate world twice, he decided to now 10 years ago start his own clinical practice. Our conversation was so juicy. Like I could talk to him for another 3 hours. We started talking about the importance of getting to know the self and the importance of that, and how knowing the self is not actually selfish, it's altruistic, because that in turn then impacts your career, your relationships, your friendships, your life in essence. We then talk about relationships and the ways that, relationships sometimes struggle, and how we can overcome the struggle, and how we need to clean our relationships regularly so that we don't fall into this pit hole of contempt, resentment, and eventually stonewalling. So I hope that you enjoy this conversation with me and Dr. Oberdan. I promise you, you will learn and pick up a nugget or two of wisdom. Dr. Oberdan.
Stephanie.
You've had an illustrious 2-decade-long career. You've left the corporate workplace, twice now? Mm-hmm. Maybe give my listeners and me a sort of overview of the journey into how you got to where you are today.
Okay, yeah, sure. So today I'm a psychologist and psychotherapist and clinical sexologist by trade. I arrived here after a long journey of unexpected twists and turns. My life began in the military as an officer in the paratroopers regiment in Italy. I then left Italy, moved to the UK, and then started my journey into psychology. I applied my psychology training in corporate settings first, working with both individuals on an executive coaching level as well as at a large-scale base, creating and delivering leadership change programs, culture change programs, behavioral change programs. And then 10 years ago now, is it 10 years already? Wow, okay, 10 years ago, I stepped out of corporate to set up my private practice. And today I mostly work in clinical settings with couples and individuals, but I also run retreats that revolve around the marriage of the mind and the body. And in particular, we run a personal growth retreat and a relationship retreat where we use robust psychology, research and knowledge, coupled with movement, breath work, and exposure to extreme cold temperatures to help people break through limiting beliefs and rediscover intimacy and connectedness.
Wow, that's sounds very holistic and broad, but also ties it all in together. I like when you say that you work with relationships and individuals. What's the ratio between the two right now?
Clinically, I would say is about 50-50. Yeah.
Interesting. Yes, I met you in a sort of relationship setting, and I've been following your blog posts as I receive your newsletters every month or so, and they're all very, very inspiring. What strikes me the most is this emphasis of understanding yourself and how important that is, and how you encourage people to get right with yourself, and how that trickles into your relationships, your career, your friendships, so on and so forth. Can you give us a little understanding as to what it means to really get to know yourself and why it's so important?
Sure. It's central to every aspect of our life. And if we begin from the idea that reality as we know it is centered on our unique perception of life, of reality, and it begins with the conditioning, the knowledge that we acquire throughout life. It's a unique lens, and whether we realize it or not, it informs every single aspect of our life, as you already suggested. Now, oftentimes you would hear people talk about discovering the authentic self, which is something that I don't particularly subscribe to, for the very reason that speaking about an authentic self implies that the other types of selves that we occupy outside of that elusive, authentic self are fake. But the truth is that they are not. They are who we are anyway. And the way I simplified the framework is by looking at 3 core types of selves, all of which are real and authentic. The first one, I call it the curated self. This is the person we put into the world under a guise that has usually been prepared for. And prepared for means I've studied for it, I've trained for it, I've specifically dedicated my time to creating it, curating it, and eventually embodying it. And so it could be my role as a psychologist, it could be my role as a speaker, it could be my role as a therapist. Things for which I have occupied time, effort, and energy to prepare. It doesn't have to be just in a professional settings. It can also be in the way in which I engage with play or art or whatever other activity, whatever other self that I embody for which I prepared. The second type of self is what I call the inherited self. These are the roles that I find myself in for which I didn't ask and for which I didn't need to prepare. And therefore, me being a son and the role I occupy as a son in life to my parents is inherited. It's what I found myself to be. If I think about the role of brother or the role of friend or the role of partners, even though the last 2 types do have a degree of preparation to it, but these mostly are the type of selves that we occupy and that make up our external worldly reality, and that while very different one from the other, both are real, both are authentic. They're just circumstantial and situational. The third and final type of self that I like to talk about, and it's probably the closest to what people think about when they talk about authentic self, is what I call our essence. This is the blueprint that we carry within. So this is internal to us. Doesn't necessarily get manifested. But it's the closest that we get to the blueprint that we acquired in our birth. And I love to use the analogy of a peach tree. And let's say that for argument's sake, I was born a peach tree. My destiny is therefore that of becoming a peach tree and making the juiciest, sweetest peaches that this tree can make. The problem with the way in which we then usually enter the curated cells or the inherited cells is that the world has taught us that to be successful and accepted and loved, we must become pear trees. And so we have this internal self with a blueprint to become what it needs to become, which is then at odds with these other 2 external worlds, the curated and the inherited one, where we are compelled to subscribe to certain rules and expectations and guidelines and roles that aren't necessarily aligned with us.
Why do you think that is?
Because society wouldn't work otherwise if it wasn't somewhat organized to a system, and the system that we have subscribed to and refined over centuries and millennia is the one we occupy. And so no one, unless we choose to retire to a off-grid life, can live in a system with rules and not somehow work within these rules.
How does one, though, you say blueprint, and it kind of reminds me of DNA. When you're talking about the selves, you go from external to internal. And I actually have a friend right now whose boss is sending him on a CEO training program, wanting him to progress in the company. But inside, he's like, I don't know if this is my path, but this is a great opportunity. It's by the book. But deep down, he's questioning that. How does one know what their own blueprint is, and how do they sort of pivot to, okay, I'm in a direction of becoming a pear tree, but there's that peach tree that I'm supposed to be?
Yeah, great question. It all begins with looking at the dashboard. We, in our everyday activities, are constantly receiving signals from our being that mostly we ignore. And if you think about any human being being the composition at its most foundational level of 4 bodies, a physical body, an intellectual one, an emotional one, and a spiritual one, each are constantly speaking to us. In the same way in which if we're driving a car and we want to know whether we have sufficient fuel, we're going at the right speed, whether the system is in full working order, we look at the dashboard. We learn to recognize the symbols and the dials, and we find peace in recognizing that, yep, everything is in order, let's continue. The truth with most of us is we are so conditioned to meet external expectations and demands that we often do so at the expense of ourselves. And so to go to the specific question about your friend, we might indeed, from physical symptoms, thought patterns, emotional sensations and feelings that emerge as felt experiences in the body, feedback that we get from our community, we may indeed have a very clear sense that we are veering off path, and we are certainly moving more towards being the pear tree than not the peach tree. But because of limiting beliefs most often, and sometimes practical circumstances that we genuinely cannot escape, we often sacrifice our own self at the expense of continuing to meet the job objectives, the partner's demands, the life reality that is external to us. So how does one reconnect and realign with that? My first advice is look at the dashboard, listen to the noises and the alerts, and look at the symbols. If you are changing your sleep patterns and suddenly you're not resting so well, maybe there's something to look at. If that tension in the shoulder, the neck, or the back doesn't seem to go away despite the chiropractor's visit, the yoga, the healthy exercise and living, maybe there's some tension you're holding that is telling you something. If people around you continue to say to you that something has changed, you don't seem the same, and your energy isn't quite as vital as we know it, the world, the system, the being, the dashboard are constantly speaking. Let's look at the dashboard. Let's learn to recognize it and not ignore it.
I love that use of the analogy of a dashboard, coming back and just noticing the signs, be it like what's happening in the body, whether it's your stress levels or, like you said, that pain in your neck that doesn't go away, your sleep patterns. Yeah, I think it's hard for some people because the money's so good and, there's an opportunity to become a CEO at some point, but at what expense? Yeah,
I want to add something to that, because often when I have this conversation with clients, their almost immediate perception is that I am suggesting for them to drop everything they've built to date to then go and pursue their peach tree life. But as I mentioned at the beginning, sometimes there are practical circumstances we cannot escape, or indeed we do not want to let go of, because they have indeed built a lifestyle for us and our loved ones that we very much enjoy. And so in that case, and in most cases, I would say, some cases extreme where it's important to let go completely, but in most cases, I think it's more about finding a balance so that we can continue to apply our efforts and energy to what we have built, but so that we don't do it at the expense of ourselves. And often what I find with clients who are willing to build this parallel universe, shall we call it, where they finally make some me time, quality, meaningful me time, is that the experience they have of life overall also improves. And suddenly things that earlier felt overwhelming or stressful at work, at home, actually change, because they genuinely and generally feel a lot more at peace with themselves. And so this links back to your original question, why is the self important? Because if I'm walking about life with a gray, gloomy lens applied to my glasses, it doesn't matter what I engage with. It could be the most exciting adventure ever, but it'll still be tainted by the gloomy gray lens that I've applied to the world. At the same time, I could be in quite dire circumstances, and suddenly my mindset shifts because I'm finding peace within myself, and I find that those circumstances aren't so stressful after all.
What prohibits someone from connecting to themselves?
I would say often is conditioning. You see, it's my experience that regardless of culture, geography, even age actually, even to this day, we are educating children and continuing thereafter into adulthood to very rarely look within in a genuine, authentic way that says, the essence that Dr. O was talking about, what is that really about? What are you talented about? What are you skillful for? What are you dreaming of? What calls you? What uses your energy in almost an effortless way that we can potentially nurture and grow so that you can still become a useful member of society, but in a way that is aligned to what you are naturally gifted with, because indeed they are gifts no matter what they are. And when we go through a family system and a school system and a state system and a religious system and a professional system and an academic system, where over and over and over and over it's been repeated to us that what's important is that we meet these external objectives, which could be keep your elbows off the table, eat with your cutlery, don't throw food on the table, you have to share with your brother and sister, be kind, don't show anger. Okay, here's the school curriculum. We don't particularly find it interesting to know what you are naturally talented at. You just have to complete this program, which will then promote you to the next year. If you don't, we'll hold you back. And then eventually we go to university and it's the same. We go to work and it's the same. So we have decades of conditioning that reinforce the belief and the need to subscribe to, pay attention to, and comply with external demands that provide that beautiful illusion that if I meet them all, I'll eventually be happy. And I'll have the house, the 2.1 children, the white fence, the dog, or whatever vision of life you have. But the truth is, it doesn't happen. And I work with a lot of very, very accomplished individuals at the top of success as defined broadly, who don't feel very full, very happy, very satisfied with the life they've built. And often it's because they've built a life that isn't their own.
As you were talking just now, I started to feel like this heavy weight on me and like, the system and like so many boundaries. And so, it's almost like your own little prison that you're building for yourself. And I can imagine. I think I was in a situation before where I feel like I had everything, where the house and the dog and this and that, and then, but something wasn't right with myself. And even just, moving out and getting, moving into a room, simplifying my life, there was that freedom from within. And it's just, it's just that difference that,
it's a
strange
very
paradigm.
difficult balance to find,
Right.
You see. One of the phenomena I see these days, especially with younger adults who, unlike my generation, have had access to information through the internet in a very ready, accessible way, is there is a movement towards individual self-expression. But at the same time, we have to remember we do occupy a system that operates by certain rules. So I want to expand on the idea of your own little prison, as you just labeled it, and the idea of individual expression to illustrate what I believe could be a good balance. So first of all, however narrow the prison might feel, whether it is an intimate relationship or a job or a particular company or a geographic or political setting, even within what appears to be very narrow constraints, usually we actually have a lot of freedom. And so imagine a parent who's educating a child and wants to do so in a way that stretches the child's boundaries so that they can grow and learn, but doesn't provide so much freedom that the child can expose themselves to really dangerous things. And so a parent would make that space, keep it safe, hold those boundaries, and at the same time, hopefully, would give the child total freedom to explore the infinite range of variabilities that exist within that limit. And the same happens as we grow into adulthood in all circumstances. Often the perception of the prison is one that we carry psychologically more than in reality, because it doesn't matter how strict the rule book is. There is no rule book that can account and police and advocate for everything that the system requires in its operation and its existence. So however narrow the setting in which we find ourselves, I believe a lot of what we feel as a prison, it's our own limitation in the way we feel, think, and see ourselves within that system. And so reconnecting to ourselves in an authentic way so that we can marry the curated self with the inherited self, with the essence, with the internal self, and within the constraint of the system find a way to express ourselves that operates by the acceptable degree of freedoms of the rules, while at the same time giving expression to who we are, is, in my opinion, the sweet spot where we get the opportunity to enjoy the system that we occupy, most of which we haven't asked for, we find ourselves in, or indeed shape it in a way that fits our needs also, and connect to who we are and experience it as alive, as vital, as useful, acceptable, lovable.
How important is a partner in this whole process that you've just laid out?
I'll expand your question and then I'll answer it more specifically. Collaboration and connection with others is fundamental, both from an evolutionary perspective.
Relationships,
Absolutely.
whoever.
Absolutely. Family. There's plenty of research that demonstrates the value of connectedness to others as a predictor of future success and health, longevity, wealth, and so on and so forth. So by definition, I would say, given who we are as beings who have evolved over the millennia the way we have, collaboration and connection are fundamental. But it goes without saying that those collaborations and connections ideally would, most of the time, be helpful and healthy. So how important is a partner within that system? Well, it's very important if you dream of a life in companionship with another with whom you build a future of one kind or another. But if their relationship is, for whatever reasons, dysfunctional, then the impact that can have on all aspects of life, including ourself, can be quite dire. So similar to what I was sharing earlier around finding the sweet spot between expressing oneself while accepting that there are rules within which we operate, the same goes with a relationship. And ideally, we find someone and connect with someone with a clear sense of who we are and what we have to offer, and a clear sense of what we connect with that remains healthy. Because that becomes the opportunity and the foundation to create a union where two, let's call them complete maybe not because we're constant work in progress, but full right now individuals can come together and create a third and separate entity that can become beyond their wildest expectations. But you see, it's predicated upon the expectation and the proviso that I know who I am, and therefore I know also what I have to offer and what I'm looking for. And many people, having spent decades focused externally with no one, not even themselves often, asking who am I, what are my talents, what do I offer to the world, how am I valuable, it means that we often end up in relationships that are not good for us, and is not quite clear why.
You've literally answered my question just there. I was like, is the greatest predictor of relationship longevity that you need to know yourself as much as you can before getting into another relationship? That's been a huge thing for me, at least for last year when I was single for a whole year. And it's the first time I've been single for a year since, I don't even know if I should be saying it on this podcast, but pretty much ever. Okay. And a lot of that was getting to know myself more. And then getting into another relationship, I feel much more complete and I understand where my triggers are. I understand what I'm sensitive about. I understand what my strengths are. I know what's important to me, what I don't like, what I do like. And that feels like the communication has become better because of that. I'm not trying to find myself through someone else. But so you would say that, for example, if one of my friends just came out of a 4 or 5 year relationship and they got into a relationship within a month, would that be a little bit tricky? Do you advise that people sort of keep to themselves for a little bit after a long-term relationship to regroup before getting into a whole nother mess? Or sorry, not mess. Did I say mess? I don't know. That might have been a Freudian slip, but you know what I mean.
So many questions there. Let me start with the broader picture again.
Okay.
You asked whether it's necessary or important to know oneself as much as possible before entering a relationship. And that would imply that there is a sequence to follow. And therefore, if I could paraphrase, it's as if you were saying, I can have a relationship if and only if I have figured out enough about myself. And the truth is that life doesn't happen like that, and life doesn't work like that. Many times, most of the times, we are running parallel stories and realities, and the truth is that we are work in progress until the very last day. So if we were to take the idea literally and enter a relationship if and only if or when I have figured myself out enough, then basically we would never have a relationship because there's always so much to discover. So I think the shorter answer would be it's okay to enter a relationship at any time, knowing and accepting that I have sufficient curiosity, interest, and energy applied to knowing who I am and continuing to knowing who I am, while at the same time putting some energy into the relationship and getting to know this other person. Accepting also what? That as we engage with anybody, partners, friends, new colleagues, bosses, or whatever, we will always encounter a situation for which we weren't prepared, and therefore situation that may elicit responses, physical, intellectual, emotional, or otherwise, that we didn't even know were ready to come out from us. And so the idea that we should be prepared, fully know ourselves before we are ready to, is similar to saying, when are we going to be ready to be parents? When are we going to be ready to be whatever? And we're never going to be ready. We're going to be ready enough. And we need to accept that there's going to be a wide range of uncertainties that will test us, that will cause conflict, which is not necessarily bad in a relationship. In fact, I would say it's welcome. It needs to be a certain type of conflict, but welcome. And that we trust enough in ourselves and our partner to deal with these differences and these conflicts as they emerge, trusting that we're committed and we want to move forward and learn together.
Yeah, I think, what I meant by that was, or at least just from my own sphere of influence and from what people talk to me about, is that there should be, it's not like a prescribed amount of time between relationships, but it's when they know that they're jumping into something from like a similar pattern as before.
In which case you're answering your own question, because that's the dashboard. If they know they are jumping in a relationship only 1 month after, and that they are falling into the same patterns that have a foregone conclusion, that's an example of, I know my dashboard is speaking to me and blinking and showing all sorts of icons like a Christmas tree lit up, but No, I find this
It's fine.
exciting and it's
Yeah.
fun and we have great sex and
Yeah,
the
yeah.
chemistry is great. We have great parties and friends.
So when trauma happens, essentially, or when there's enough of a rattling of the dashboard, do they then decide, okay, you know what, I need to be by myself. I need to like look inwards. Maybe it's actually my problem. Maybe I need to figure this out before I get into the next ordeal and repeat the same patterns again.
And as you say, sadly, often the problems that people encounter is something that they did have red flags for early on in the process. But again, there's so many variables at play in choosing the right thing to do every day in pursuit of our life vision that sometimes is very, very difficult to clearly discern how to really move forward. And therefore, often we just go for the path of least resistance because it's easier to continue with the fun pattern of a dangerous liaison than to actually pause and look within and do the work and redress the balance and move forward in a healthier way. It's, once again, it's a question of balance.
You say the path of least resistance. This is the decision to go through another relationship even though there are red flags, as opposed to being alone.
You see, there's an equation we carry in our mind which is very powerful. And the equation is familiar equals safe. Familiar equals safe. And so imagine a child who grew up in an abusive or avoiding environment and learned, for example, not to connect to their own emotions as a way of surviving the turmoil and the chaos at home. It is possible that in the type of relationships this person recreates in the future, even though intellectually they might have understood and even crave emotional intimacy and connection, they might continue to recreate patterns of avoidance because that's what they are familiar with. And so let's take it one step further. Let us assume that this person meets a partner who is instead very expressive, very open, very emotional, multifaceted in the way they express their physicality, their thoughts, their emotions. It can be a very appealing proposition to be with someone who secretly in the back recesses of our mind is going to show us the way to unlock our own expression, which we've kept hidden away for so many years. Now, if we're not careful, however, knowing that the attraction is a desire to be completed by someone who presents the opposite to who we are and what we aspire to, we might end up in a situation where actually their way of being becomes overwhelming. And it may be overwhelming because we're not familiar with it, because we don't know what intimacy looks like, because it provides the opportunity of an unknown that we might be scared of failing within. And so often, unbeknown to us, we end up recreating patterns of familiarity, not because they are functional and useful for us, but because we are familiar with it. And even though we might know that they are not functional or useful, because I know how to deal with it, it's easier for me to go back there and do the same. And perhaps another analogy could be smoking. You know, if we walk in the street, stop a random smoker and ask them, hey, Mr. and Miss Smoker, do you know that it kills you? And they would probably show us the cigarette packet and say, do you see what kind of pictures they put here? Of course I know. And yet, even though intellectually they know, there's something familiar about the soothing feeling or the way they look cool or something that they derive from the experience that is familiar, and therefore they feel safe to go back to, even when they know it's destructive. And it's the same with relationships.
When you say this, it reminds me of those attachment styles,
yes.
right? And, you know, if you are avoidant,
Yes.
you grew up that way, you know, do you think that, or at least from your experience, do you notice that what attachment styles work well together? I know secure attachment styles are like unicorns and they're very rare. Most of us are quite anxious or avoidant, at least from just from what I know and from my own personal experience as well. Is this something that, is there a formula there? Or is it more just an awareness of like, okay, I know that you're avoidant. So as someone who is your partner, I need to communicate with you in a way that sort of soothes that, overbearing nature that avoidants don't like, or, that assures you if you're anxious. Is there a sort of formula there? I mean, I know there's not an exact formula. I know it's such a dance, but like,
I like the fact that you use the word dance. I often use that word myself. Is there a formula? No, because the uniqueness of the individuals and the situations that come together in a relationship makes it so that it's impossible to say, here's the formula, here's the script. Now, obviously, there are things that we can do, which eventually one can put in a formula or a recipe, but I tend to stay away from very definitive prescriptions that say step one,
Of
step two,
course,
step three,
yeah.
and your life will be different. Not quite. But in the most typical setup where two partners meet, get together with the intention and the idea of working through life and building something together, and then encounter the challenges that emerge from their background, their upbringing, their traumas, their personality differences, and so on and so forth. It goes without saying that, number one, learning about ourselves, as we already said earlier, is a necessary condition to begin with. Because if I can recognize that this thing my partner is doing triggers something in me that I've carried for 50 years, I'm less likely to throw it back at my partner and blame them, and I'm more likely to recognize that, oh, okay, this reminds me of something that I still have to process and heal, and that my partner so coincidentally happens to poke when they do this thing. So first of all, I'll reinforce the need to know oneself and to have done sufficient work to at least gather sufficient tools and skills to deal with life, because there will continue to be challenges, including those that are beyond our capability. Number two, I think there needs to be a sense of curiosity placed outwardly towards our partner, and indeed the third entity, which is separate from the other person, the relationship itself. Because our partner exists in their own right outside of us, with a whole life story that they themselves probably don't remember, let alone we ever learning it in enough details to know exactly how to maneuver around them. But with that sense of curiosity, therefore, and hopefully, comes the openness to then at least suspend judgment most of the times when something unskillful happens, to have then sufficient skills and tools, once again, inside the relationship to work together and say, hey, that thing that you do say or don't say, I kind of find it hurtful. Can we look at it together? Can we try and repair it, because I feel it's impacting the relationship? And it doesn't need two secure individuals to be able to have this kind of language. If there's sufficient commitment and openness to our own vulnerability and humanity, which by definition means that we are imperfect and incomplete, and we can bring that vulnerability to the relationship in the way we relate to ourselves and to the others, then doesn't matter whether we are anxious, avoidant, disorganized, attached, but the reality is we can work towards becoming a safe emotional place for each other. And it's funny because in therapy we say the problem is never the problem. You know, people argue about, I don't know, the socks on the floor, the aircon on, the lights are on too much, you're spending this, you're spending that. But often, in fact, almost always, it has nothing to do with the object of contention. There's something underlying the argument that is a lot more profound, and that usually has to do with a sense of connectedness and safety and vulnerability, or not, lack thereof, within the relationship.
Let's say that a relationship has now lost that, lost the vulnerability, lost the sense of safety for communication, where they, don't talk anymore just to keep the peace for the child. I'm sure that, couples that come see you, they must be at a similar stage, right? People aren't coming to you to talk about how jolly their relationship is, maybe hopefully hopefully by the end of the sessions they are. But, what are the main sort of barriers to overcoming any entanglement in a marriage or in a relationship?
Few points to answer there. I think the first, more of a generic point, a lot of people seek therapy to improve from where they are, even when there are no crises, which is really refreshing to see. I have to admit it's not the majority, but I have had clients who recognize that, we're in a good place and it's time to, put some energy into it and evolve it to the next level. To start from the premise that, imagine people have lost that connection and they're no longer talking for the sake of, for example, the children involved. That's a very complex situation to deal with for many, many reasons. First of all, if the couple has a rupture of that kind where they're no longer talking to each other, either it's a long-standing trickling down of resentment and annoyances, nothing major, but that has been allowed to build over such a long period of time that eventually it crystallized into a really solid wall in between them. Or, as we can imagine, because there's been some form of really serious breach of trust that then has caused for this rupture to take place. The good news is that even in extreme cases, if the couple is genuinely interested in reconnecting and rediscovering a way of being that fulfills their mutual vision for the future, there is a way out of those stalemates. However, if that commitment and desire isn't there, then it becomes a very difficult journey to tread for both partners for many, many reasons. Now, when it comes to maintaining a relationship where the commitment is gone and the desire to do the work is gone, often I hear that the decision is predicated upon the idea, may I say illusion, that it will be best for the kids. But it's a very delicate decision to make.
Sorry, best for the kids if they stay together.
That's the idea, right? The idea here is we don't love each other anymore. We're no longer committed to each other, but we don't want to give a broken home to our kids. So let's stay together until they're 18 or until such time as we feel it's time to change the situation. At least they grow up in a healthier environment. But again, I do say that's an idea, maybe even an illusion, because that's not always the case. It can be the case, but what the partners have to ask themselves very, very, very carefully is beyond what's observable. Because indeed, they may be the type of partners who can not fight in front of the kids, who can maintain a facade of harmony and collaboration, but who energetically couldn't be at further opposite ends of the spectrum, or maybe energetically even dislike each other's presence enough to cause that tension that we can become accustomed to, but it doesn't go unnoticed, even if we've cancelled it from our conscious awareness. I'll give you a practical example. If I ask you to pay attention now to the sole of your feet, you become aware of the pressure that comes from gravity pushing our bodies down towards the floor. Now, until I mentioned it, you probably weren't thinking about your feet. You probably weren't thinking about that pressure. Now, you would think about that pressure if for some reason it became strong enough to catch your attention, because maybe it's uncomfortable and you want to shift your feet around. But until then, it remains below consciousness, but still it has an effect on your feet because they are being subjected to a pressure. Or a more practical, common example could be that you're so engrossed in reading a thrilling book that you don't realize that your bladder is screaming at the top of its lungs, asking you to go to the toilet. And it's only at one point when the threshold is reached that the awareness pops into consciousness and you eventually take appropriate action. And so what I'm wanting to highlight with this is, even when we are able to accept the normality of a household that is devoid of intimacy because mom and dad have disconnected 5 years ago and live in separate rooms, sleep in different bedrooms, barely talk to each other beyond the functional, we might deem that to be normal, but we still have to account for the fact that it has an impact. And especially with kids who energetically can absorb and notice so much more than we adults do because we're so distracted by so many demands and expectations, it would have an impact on them. So
yeah, they're sensitive now.
absolutely.
Kids just absorb things.
Absolutely.
You know,
And it's not-
even if they're not fighting, you know, I think it's like if they don't have an example of healthy communication or healthy conflict resolving, you know, capabilities, right?
Absolutely. And
It's yeah.
in relationships, both between the partners but also with our kids, is not only what we say or what we do that leaves an imprint and shapes this piece of marble into whatever it'll become. It is also the things that we don't say and don't do that communicate a particular message. And whether it is your partner, the kids, or whoever else is in the household, that energy would be felt, that experience would be had beyond intellect, beyond conscious awareness, in a way that still shapes.
So what I gather from that is that it's not necessarily the right thing to stay for the kid till the end, but rather to, you know, to figure out what's best for both people individually, and thus, you know, the kid will absorb whether, even if the mom and dad do get new relationships that are healthy, they still absorb that good energy and that good vibes, right? Yeah, so interesting. I have like 5 friends that are in both sides of both camps. One that's not happy but staying for the kids, and another that decided to separate early on and have a good relationship with each other even as adults. They're still friends.
That's a
you know, they're
great
still
comment.
friends as adults, and they know the stepfather, stepmother. You know, they have a good relationship with both step parents, and they're actually very healthy on an emotional front. Whereas, yeah, it's funny that sometimes I think it goes the other way for those who choose to stay and lead by a strange example.
You see, this links back to the question earlier about attachment styles. A healthy relationship is not one that is devoid of conflict. The question is, how quickly can the couple course correct and make the necessary repairs to reconnect with each other and therefore recreate an environment that is supportive for all those who are involved in it. And it is healthy for children to witness a certain level of conflict, because conflict in a good way is effectively the presentation of differences that need to be negotiated and hopefully will be negotiated skillfully. And so when we focus on dealing with the difference rather than attacking the partner for who they are or how they think or what they feel, then we're focusing on the parts that can be changed, can be addressed, and demonstrate a healthy way of dealing with life, which will invariably bring conflict because there's differences all around that we have to negotiate till the last day.
It's like the moment you let it fester and just build that resentment, it's so hard to untangle, right? It's just address it right away, keep the slate clean. It's like just keep, or at least that's how I see things right now in relationships as it stands, is like just to not to stack the layers, but the moment there's a layer of resentment or an issue, just sort of clean it and then just keep things a little pure before it gets that way.
It's easier to
said than
go
done.
into a garden that we have already curated and maintain it by, removing the odd weeds and watering the various plants, than to let it be until nature takes over and it becomes a jungle again, and then have to go back into that garden and trying to make sense of it. So yes, definitely, especially at the beginning, working on the foundations can be taxing, and negotiating all those differences can most certainly create conflict. But where the right tools exist, regardless of attachment styles or the errors that we will invariably make, we can make sufficient repairs to maintain an emotionally safe environment where we all grow.
I feel like I can talk to you for another 3 hours on this topic because there's so much more to share.
Yes.
But I just wanted you to leave my listeners with something. It could be on the idea of the self or finding yourself with greater ease, or for those who are in relationships. Are there any parting words that you'd like to leave my listeners?
Yes, I would like to say, please remember, working on yourself is not selfish. It's altruistic. I often find that the idea of making time for ourselves, carving time for ourselves, is seen as a shortchanging of the responsibility and the people we have around us. The truth is, if I'm in my best physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual shape, I can be of greatest service to the ones I love and to the communities I serve. And so making space and time to work on ourselves, the curated, the inherited, and the internal one, is actually a way of being of even greater value for those whom we have around.
It's been such an honor to have you on the podcast. Thank you for
Thank you.
all of your wisdom, Dr. Oberdan. Thanks for being on the pod.
Thank you.
Wasn't that just such a good episode? I literally could have spoken to him for another 2 hours. I'm not even joking. I have so many questions for him still. Maybe I'll invite him back on the podcast another time. But if you'd like to learn more about his retreats that he offers, it's all in the links in the episode description below. Do take a look. He offers retreats for both relationships and individuals that combine this ice-cold therapies that he's also certified in as well. So do take a look at the episode description. And if you loved this episode, please do give us a shout out, share this with a friend or someone that you know who's going through their own relationship issues. I sure am going to send them to a few of my friends. And if you want, you can also give us a 5-star rating because you know what? It's free and you can show some love. Why not? Till next time, move easy, take care, and I'll see you back in the next episode of Listening Well.